And now to our panel discussion, our roundtable discussion. I'm going to hand over to Stefaan Verhulst to lead the discussion, which is entitled From Data Intelligence to Decision Intelligence, Insights into Action. The aim is to discuss and provide you with strategies to use data to improve how decisions are made in the public interest. Your moderator, Stefaan Verhulst, lives and breathes data and society. In 2018, he was recognized as one of the 10 most influential academics globally in digital government by Apolitical. Amongst many other roles, he is co-founder and chief research and development officer at the Governance Lab, the GovLab, an action research center based at New York University. Over to you, Stefaan.
Thanks so much for this kind introduction, and delighted to be here today, and indeed, happy Open Data Day. And as mentioned, I'm Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab. And for those who don't know GovLab, we are an action research center focused on how do we transform the way we make decisions in the public interest, leveraging new technologies and new science. And particularly, we have focused on how can we actually leverage data in order to improve the way we go about problem solving, the way we go about public service delivery, the way we go about defining and designing public policy. And obviously, a key condition in order to improve decisions as a result of data is that one needs to have access to data. And so that's why for the last few years, we've been advocating and working around open data, specifically open government data. But also we've been working around how do we access and open up other data assets, such as the privately held data for public interest purposes. We've written several books around how, and it is actually quite sequential from anyway how this is organized, because what Laura was talking about with regard to impact is something that we've also been focusing on. And so we've written several books about how open data can improve decision making and what's the impact of open data. And one key takeaway from all that work is that the impact of open data is basically a two-step process. We go from data to insight, and then we need to go from insight to action. Because without going from insight to action, we have no impact that is societal. We might have better understanding of the problem, we might have a better knowledge, but if it's not made actionable, the impact remains limited. And that's where we become most interested in how do we go beyond data intelligence, i.e. how do we go beyond providing insight as a result of open data, but also turning that into decision intelligence so that it's actionable and so that open data has more impact than initially perceived or intended. And that's the focus of today's, of this panel, which is really trying to go beyond the release of open data and go beyond the generating insight, which obviously in itself is already quite often hard enough. But we do need to go what we can call the last mile of open data, which is how do we again go from insight to action, and how do we create a decision kind of ecosystem that is informed by an open data ecosystem. And so that's what we will be focusing on in this panel. And we have three amazing panelists that will provide their wisdom as it relates to how to go from data intelligence through decision intelligence. And so we have Jessica Seddon joining today, who is the global lead of air quality at the World Resources Institute, and specifically the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, where she's working around how do we leverage data, for instance, in order to indeed improve the way we go about air quality and other related environmental challenges. And then we have Claudia Juech, who is the Vice President of Data and Society at the Patrick McGovern Foundation, and has worked for many years around how do we indeed leverage data, but also leverage scientific insights and other approaches in order to, for instance, strengthening the nonprofit sector as it relates to how they go about solving public problems, addressing public needs, and so on. And then last but not least, we have Javier de la Torre. And again, I probably pronounce it in more of a French way than a Spanish way, Javier. I apologize for that. but Javier is the founder and chief strategy of CARTO, which is one of the, from my point of view, one of the more exciting companies that are working on visualization and also really working on how do we go beyond just describing and reporting, but also turning it into actually action. So with that, let's get started, and no further introduction from my end, because we are here mainly to learn from the experts that are in the panel. And let me start with Claudia, and this will be the opening question to all of you, is why should we care? Meaning, why are we focusing on this last mile of open data, and how does it relate to some of the work that you are doing? Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you, Stefan, and thanks for inviting me to this very interesting, or kind of contribute to this very interesting question. So why do we care? Clearly the most important question of all, and I would say that the nonprofit organizations or the kind of the sector of nonprofit organizations that I represent here, they are leaving things on the table. They are leaving potential for impact on the table if they are not getting better at using data. Data, like other instruments that nonprofits have to achieve impact, to make progress on their missions towards kind of critical questions, whether it's on issues of food security or climate change. Data, I believe strongly, is a critical input into making progress on those questions. And it's a very new field still. It's very early days for the most part. I think in the beginning, especially when it related to making data openly available, we thought, well, we build it and they will come. And so this wasn't different from kind of many other fields. I think we are past that, but there's still much to do on the demand side. How can we further develop the demand side? And as you say, really turn that into decisions. I think there are a couple of aspects that are necessary for that. At the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, we are working on making the use of data and AI available, accessible to nonprofit organizations by providing grants and technical assistance. But most importantly, I feel we are talking about helping nonprofits to develop a data use culture. I feel it's like training a muscle. It's not something that you do one-off on a project, but it's something that you develop as an organizational competency and as an infrastructure to be able to really scope out the data projects and have them respond to the decisions you want to take. So you start with the decision and then work backwards and say, what kind of data assets do I need? What kind of models? What kind of external data assets do I need to inform my decision, and to do that on an ongoing basis? I think, secondly, one thing that I find can still be improved on in the nonprofit sector, we have assumptions in terms of what will happen if we have those data insights available. And sometimes we work with nonprofit organizations to develop basically a data theory of change, as we call it in our sector. So who needs to act? What are the incentives for those stakeholders to act if new data insights become available? What will trigger that if you think about an advocacy project? So it's similar to what I said at some point. A good policy brief doesn't make for good policy, and the same is true for data insights as well. And when I now kind of mentioned these two first points, you will have noticed none of these really talked about technical competencies necessarily. And I think that is also important to note, that for the most part, when we work with nonprofit organizations, it's really the visionary ability of leadership of the CEOs, of the C-level, of the CTOs, to create that environment to really make data count when it comes to decision making. So those are some of my kind of insights from my past years of working.
Great, thanks so much, Claudia. And I do like the data change theory, which we might explore in further questions here as well. But over to you, Javier, same question. And especially you've done a lot of work, of course, on making mapping enter the 21st century. But how do we, why do we care? And how does it relate to your work?
Sure. Thank you, Stefan, and hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. So, well, I mean, describe in the intro. So we work in a company called CARTO. We work on enabling organizations to do spatial analysis. So it's making maps, but also really in the core understanding why things happen somewhere so that they can act upon it. So this question is very relevant, and particularly, in my background on biodiversity and climate change, this is a fundamental question, right? So how do we move now from insight into action, right? So unfortunately, we're not seeing necessarily the action that we think is necessary when it comes to climate change, and that kind of like in a way, drives this question about like what happens if we do have quite a lot of data and we have quite a lot of insights of what is it happening when it comes to deforestation or like the rising of temperatures and like the emissions and so on, why we're not taking action into that. Again, this is something that happens in many other things at the same time. And from our CarLab perspective, I mean, we work with so-called geospatial data, right? We work with things like Earth observation data, we work with demographics, we work with infrastructure data, we work with very large amounts of data that tend to be quite complicated to analyze, and then very often end up in so-called kind of like these reports or dashboards, then like people get their insights from. And what seems to kind of like not be working with these models is that this kind of like, on one side, doesn't necessarily allows the consumers of that information to put themselves into the data that they're looking at. They're not really able to kind of like modify different scenarios, place to understand, like the models, the characteristics of whatever model is being presented to them. They just see essentially a static report. So, so from my point of view, I mean, one of the things that we see is that like we need to move beyond, in a way, these systems of information where you just kind of like just dump data in front of insights in front of you, and provide a more kind of like interactive type of like experiences that allows you to go and have a deeper conversation, and kind of like understand different models. So that's number one. The other one that we see quite often in our industry, we work a lot on areas around, for example, sustainability, in the area of sustainability sourcing. We're presenting here, for example, as a map of the Global Forest Watch initiative, tracking deforestation worldwide. And we work with organizations on the CPG, consumer goods. Like those companies, they're starting to care really heavily about the sustainability. Now, the problem that very often they find is that it's first of all hard to find data that they can use to act upon, to decide where they source and how they source materials and goods. But it's also like very often those information systems are disconnecting from the operation systems. So very often you will find dashboards and reports created like to give you insights around how sustainable your operations is going and information around the company or a place. But then you actually take your decisions in a separated system where the data is not present. So if let's say that like a company is in the business of they need to buy palm oil or whatever other good, if at that point where they're actually choosing between one provider and another, if actually the information, the insights, the indicators for sustainability are presented at the place of the decision, we've seen that actually that increases the usage of the action on the data that is given, because it's put it at the place at the time where you're making the decision, right? And that the shorter that you can make that period from like when you take the decision and the distance of how far you are from the data that you want it to be upon and the place where you're taking the decision, the shorter it is, the more you influence it. And that means that we need to go beyond probably like this, again, reports, external reports, and add some of those insights right into the ERPs, into the operations systems of those organizations. So that's one experience, like something that we find a lot, and the result of this can be quite fundamental. I mean, the data is there in a lot of these challenges. It's the act that is missing, and if we're not actually facilitating that, well, I think we all know we're going to be in deep trouble.
Great, thanks so much, Javier, for those two reflections, which are essential indeed. And one of the areas that we also here have worked on and looked into is this creation of those decision theaters, where you actually, really bring data to the place where decisions are made at the moment when they are made, and how that can be actually designed in an ongoing way. Now, the challenge, of course, is that, quite often decisions are made on an ongoing basis, and quite often it's very hard to determine what is the right trigger moment to actually introduce those kinds of data insights as well. But we will come back to that as well. Over to you, Jessica. Meaning you've heard already a lot from Claudia and Javier, and again, why do we care? And also, perhaps some reflections on what you've heard already. But also, how does it relate to the work that you're doing, especially around, of course, this whole issue of air quality as well?
Thank you, Stefan, and thanks to everyone for giving me a space on this panel. I have to apologize for the noise in the background. I do have a construction project next door that I don't have total control over. I think what Claudia and Javier have said is essentially to frame this gap between data intelligence and decision intelligence as something like a gap between knowing and doing. And if you look at much of what we're gathering data around, what we're attempting to know, these are societal issues, these are environmental issues that if we don't start responding to the signals, if we don't start acting differently based on what the data are telling us, we're actually in real trouble as a species. And so in some ways, this movement from data intelligence to decision intelligence is a matter of, it's a fairly existential consideration. I look at decision intelligence as a fundamentally social phenomenon. If you want action, you need groups of people who are motivated and able to move together in an effective direction. So not one single dictator who has a perfect information system, has all the data, makes a decision which somehow instantly becomes reality. That's not how the world works, even when someone aspires to be a dictator. What we need is to figure out how can we better use data to create the conditions under which groups of people have the energy and the ability to move in the right direction. This concept of decision intelligence as a social phenomenon, in some ways came from my academic background in game theory, looking at how much the information environment, who knows what, matters for what's possible in terms of collaboration, what's possible for dispute resolution, what impedes dispute resolution or any sort of bargaining. But I think it's incredibly relevant in the work that I've now done for the past couple of decades on environmental action or response to environmental change, because we can see that much of the science are there, much of the data are there. In air quality, for example, we know that it's bad for health. We know that it's bad for climate. We know that it takes 25% off renewable energy generation and 15% off of crop yields. We know. How do we get that response? So for me, this question about decision intelligence and what I've been building into the program at World Resources Institute. Incidentally, I'm actually very happy to see the Global Forest Watch up here because that's partly a WRI program trying to bring measures of measures of deforestation directly into the decision theater, but also into the accountability theater. So the question for me is, with decision intelligence, is how do we, when, where, and how can data actually create enough of a locally shared reality to enable new constructive relationships? How can we use data to enable new contracts, new forms of management, new sourcing decisions, new sense of mutually agreed outcomes so we can use mechanisms we have like outcome-based finance. That question of how do we trigger new governance arrangements and how do data play a role in that is often ignored, but I think it's a really important dimension of the return on opening data. And with that, I think I just want to add in this emphasis of how do we trigger the social response, not the individual knowledge.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. Really valuable. And I do like the approach as decision intelligence as a social phenomenon. And I want to build upon that and go back to Claudia. And obviously, if indeed it is a social phenomenon, then obviously we do have to deal with some of the asymmetries that actually exist in society as it relates to decision making, right? And so one of the questions related to decision intelligence is then, of course, well, who makes the decisions for whom? And how do we make that how do we use data, for instance, to also make it more equitable, that there is a broader decision base that might, anyway, have a better deliberation about what it actually means and how to move forward as well. I don't know, Claudia, is that something that you have seen in the areas that you work, and especially how do we bring the equitable lens also to the data intelligence area?
That's, of course, a critical question for us, Stefan. How can we kind of make these processes more equitable and more inclusive? But before I get to that, I would like to build on what Jessica shared, which I thought were great points, the kind of decision intelligence as a social phenomenon, and maybe adding two pieces to that from a maybe more data technical perspective, because I think one thing that we are seeing when we are working with nonprofits is that they have shared with us that they want to improve on is that they recognize when they support policy-making processes, that these are, by their nature, multi-stakeholder processes, and the different stakeholders have different questions. And so how can they rerun and adapt models that they have faster? That is, for example, something that nonprofits have come to us with as a question, because to really, so all of these different stakeholders don't need the same data, don't need the same data insights, but how can we respond to that? And I think a second point that I would like to make in this context is that, and Forest Watch, I think, is an excellent, excellent example overall, but it also is an example of, at the moment, a lot of that information is kind of at the global level. And I think one movement that we are seeing is how can we break down the open data portals that we have so that they become better subnational or local. So that is, I think, another important aspect as part of this discussion. Coming back to the equitable and the inclusive, I think it has a lot to do with how can we strengthen the capacity of local groups in terms of them having the ability to contextualize the open data or the data that's being made available and really frame it in their context. But it also means for groups who are working on data, how can they really bring organizations from the collection to the data use and the data reuse into the process, and not have them, I feel often we just talk about one step of the data journey and then we want to be kind of inclusive, but I think that's not enough. I think it's really runs the whole gamut, and we need to build the data literacy of these groups so that they can really fully contribute. I think the last point on that is, I've been thinking about, and I know that other groups are thinking about this human-centered designs, kind of the different personas. How can we really design solutions so that they work for organizations or people, communities that are not that advanced in their data journey and don't need to be, but how can they access and provide input into these different processes?
Great. Thanks for that, Claudia. And again, this is perfectly, anyway, all those points we can build upon. And especially, I want to go back to Javier, because Global Forest Watch has been mentioned now several times, and I'm not sure we actually have shown it. But but anyway, I would be interested, Javier, to learn about how you have, in practice, tried to actually go from reporting into more scenario building, including, as what Claudia was referring to, be able to actually present data in a way that meets different needs, right? And that indeed it is a social phenomenon, which means that there are different actors quite often that have to be part of the decision making, but they have different questions. And how do we deal with them in a more interactive, kind of agile way, without saying this is the only way we will present the data, and go and figure it out, right? Now we need to make decisions based upon it, but there are still many questions unanswered, for instance. So over to you, Javier.
Sure. So yeah, we actually right now I think we are presenting Global Forest Watch as one example on the slides for this panel. So Unitaim is a project, like we've said, from the World Resources Institute, a number of partners collecting information around deforestation and other factors around forests around the world. It's live updated, and the live updated. I mean, there's, I believe now almost monthly updates. And it's a great source if you're interested in this type of alerts. Now, to your, and this is another example. Great. Well, so actually talking about these two maps, this map that you're looking at right now on the slides is actually a vaccination map. It's kind of like tracking the status of vaccination in the United States. Actually, I don't know from what day is this actually screenshot taken, I think somewhere in September. In fact, and what you can see in here is actually every person in the United States represented with a dot, and just kind of like, obviously we don't know who in particular is vaccinated or not, but you actually can, based on the vaccination percentages in different states or in different counties, you can actually recreate how the map looked like based on those percentages. So you get an idea of how vaccination is going on in a country. Now, this actually shows you, this obviously is a static image you're looking here, but maps actually represent a great way of exploring data, because one, obviously dynamic maps and like a modern maps allows you is to zoom in, right? So the idea that you can go and check your particular place, you can check your house, your neighbor, your state, like that interactivity within with the data. I mean, like maps have got it, for a number of years. And I think it's one of the things that, like makes them so also engaging in that way, right? Everybody kind of like goes and look at, like the areas that they're interested. And in that way, actually kind of like making the report or the data much more personal, because they're actually looking at the part that interests them, or, they can see, in different contexts and so on. So that's one level. And that goes to spatial data and maps, but it also goes in other data, right? It means, having things like filters and, like drill downs and, like on the technicality, on the way that you distribute your dashboard or your reports, that allows these levels of freedoms for the users to essentially kind of filter and get to the slice of the data that it might be relevant to them. So that's, I would say, is level one, is the minimum. Going from a PDF, a static image, to something that you can interact with, it's already a big step, I think, in that direction. But beyond that, the next steps is really what I will call this live modeling. Most analysis these days actually are powered by some sort of model behind the scenes. And if you cannot act on the parameters of the model, you not actually are able to kind of put yourself in different scenarios. So we need the technology in this case, like the technology products, the business intelligence tools, kind of like mapping platforms like ours, need to start kind of providing a level of flexibility, so that not only you can do this first level that I was describing, but it allows you to change the parameters of the models behind the visualizations to see and get these different scenarios what will be the outcomes. So in that way, the user has the option to put themselves into, well, what will happen under this IPCC, like 3 degrees increase on temperature, 2 degrees, what happens in this place of the world, what happens in that other place of the world, what happens to this section of the demographics, like to the low income areas, like these type of countries. That is that is a level of exploration that I truly believe, like will be necessary if we actually are going to convince more people about, a particular cloud-like topic. So that's from a technology perspective, like technology has to modernize itself to go beyond, what it does right now to enable this live modeling. The second part that we've identified also with a lot of customers is the importance of the process and how fresh the data is. So in a way, I mean, like one great way of people distrusting data is if they see the data outdated, right? So and again, that goes towards like how do we design information systems that are always updated? That we ensure that this is a great example. This vaccination map actually is updated every 4 hours. How can we make sure that these information systems stay updated always and have like good information around when was the last update? And so how do we create a system that ensures, the freshness of the data? It's pretty important because, like that is the number one reason why people do not relate to the data. Say, well, this is old data, it's just not any. So that metadata and that freshness from my point of view is super important too. And the third is in the world of maps, is about communication, right? So it's good visualization. In the case of maps, is cartography. So cartography is the language of geography, how we explain what is happening, right? And for that actually requires, like a good craft when it comes to data visualization or cartography to explain the data in a way that it's easy to understand, that doesn't lie to the user, and that like helps and facilitate the transmission of information. And unfortunately, I mean, like unfortunately, we're still in the process as society is kind of like going, and understanding more around data visualization, where we see better and better data visualizations these days. But but that's something also to care very, very much. Like the way that you visualize the data, the way that you design your cartography will have a huge impact, and you cannot. It's not just presenting the data; it's presenting the data right. And from my point of view, I mean, those three things will have a huge impact on ensuring we shorten that gap that we were talking about.
Great, thanks so much, Javier, and thanks for also sharing those slides, which indeed show on how you can actually present complex data systems into a more visual way. But also, I think what was important, what you emphasized with some of those maps, is that when we talk about decision making, quite often we talk about decision makers sitting in some kind of a Zoom room nowadays. But actually individuals make decisions on an ongoing basis as well. And to what extent, is open data being used for individual decisions as well? And how does that relate to the way we go about presenting data as well? But over to Jessica. And one here at GovLab, one element that we are trying to explore is to what extent can we go from data intelligence to decision intelligence based upon prioritizing the question that matters. Because if quite often we get presented with data around questions that basically are not the questions that matter to the decision makers or to those that need to make decisions. And so together with Jessica, we engaged in a 100 questions initiative around air quality. And one of the interesting top questions that was prioritized was actually, how do we go from the data that we have to actually the decisions that we need to take? And so, Jessica, what was that, the fact that that is so pronounced within the air quality community, what was the signal there? And how can we act upon the clear mandate for actually going beyond the data that was identified?
I mean, I think the question that was deemed to be most important for air quality was really about how do we provoke and sustain a reaction to the data that are already there that somebody has access to. And I think that goes back to the point I was making earlier, which is that decision intelligence is about motivating and enabling a group, not simply a better or more technically correct decision by an individual. And I think, picking up on that as the overall theme, a couple of points about what we can do better. I mean, one is when we're defining what is open, we need to think through how can data be open to different question askers. Claudia referenced this idea that different stakeholders have, different questions or different examples. That has structural implications for what is decision intelligence effective openness, which means it's not just a single map or a single representation. It's also access to the model, it's interactivity, it's programmatic access to the data behind the model, so that different questions, different slices of the data, different scales, different resolutions are all possible. And all too often, I see data for good being a heavily curated user interface. For example, in air quality, a map of local variation in the air quality of a certain pollution species as open data. But if you're thinking like, how do I make that decision relevant? You don't just want to know how the air is. You want to know, where did it come from? What are the sources? What are the sources today? And that requires access to what's behind that really slick user interface. So one structural implication, I think, that came of how do we provoke a reaction is, how do we enable more questions to be asked through our platform design? The second implication that I took from how do we make data more, how do we provoke more of a reaction to data, leads to another, in some ways, technical structural point, which is how do we reconfigure our open data efforts and pipelines to be able to aggregate from diverse, locally meaningful local analysis, rather than the current, really dominant emphasis on globally comparable dissemination to local. The local take on what are the most important pollutants, for example, or what are activities that are socially meaningful that lead to emissions, those labels vary from place to place. And if we're looking at a globally comparable, say, emissions inventory with globally comparable labels for emitting activities, it may mean nothing locally and it may not resonate. And that resonance, I think, if you look at all the behavioral work, that resonance really, really matters. The third point, and the third, I think, to-do item that came from, don't just collect more data, provoke more of a response, is to think beyond the kind of criteria you have for data for individual decision-making versus social. And that really is beyond accuracy and bias. How timely is it? What's the pedigree of the data? Is it government recognized? What are the metadata? Who might, how much do you know about who produced it? How does that, that its pedigree affect the credibility or not credibility? These are all dimensions of describing data that are incredibly relevant when you're trying to match data to, I think, what you, Stefan, called the decision theater. And they're not always on top of people's minds when they're thinking about data for individual intelligence, but I think they need to be. So I think in summary, this point about we have enough data, how do we provoke more of a reaction, is coming back to what are the needs of societal interactions? What are the needs that stem from group behavior, not the cognitive model of an empowered, enlightened individual dictator? And that is a different to-do list than the one that we've been responding to so far.
Great. Thanks, Jessica, for the to-do list, meaning a lot to do, I would say, and eager to actually deconstruct that. But I think we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering whether there are any questions from the audience. And I presume that's probably the organizers that will share with us whether there are any questions that the audience would like to pose to this panel. So over to you. Are there any questions that have been formulated so far?
Yes, indeed, Stefan. We've got quite a few coming in, and the most popular question is from Alex Forsberg from Meta Solutions AB. And he asks, metadata can be used to provide better insight to policy and documents. A common problem is that we do not make policy and other documents machine readable from the start. Would you say that metadata plays an important role in the journey towards decision intelligence? So, Stefan, I'll allow you to choose who can answer that.
No, that gives me quite some authority, man, and I totally enjoyed that. But Well, it's an interesting question, and it relates, of course, to what already was mentioned by Jessica and also Javier about, anyway, it matters on what we know about the data, i.e. data about the data. And so, Javier, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Happy to connect. Yeah, of course. I mean, like big time. I mean, like metadata, it's I would say it's even more important than the data itself in many situations. So that is that is definitely crucial. And you're right. You know, when it comes to to standards and readability of metadata, that is definitely an issue. Well, if you connect it to the things that I was describing before, if we are going to start like presenting distributing models and like other forms of more complex type of like data products that we want to do scenarios, metadata is going to be critical, because metadata is what is going to allow us to create interfaces for integrating those models, changing the parameters, etc. So the concept of metadata is likely going to go more from like beyond what we know of like how is this being done and who is the author and all these type of things, to what are the parameters that I can change, what is the underlying kind of like model that has been applied, and how can I kind of change it and modify it. So it's going from like this is what it is to this is how it's being done, and so therefore you can do things around it. So I think that is definitely like the case. Metadata is going to become only more and more and more relevant.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Javier. The second most popular question from the audience is, and this is anonymous, can open data help against profit-driven lobbying in policymaking?
Great. That's an easy one. Jessica, Claudia,
I would love to say yes. I would love to say yes, but I think somehow we have to land the immediate salience of that open data. So if you look at the US, for example, we actually have a fair amount of transparency about who's funding whom, who's funding political races in other states. There's a lot of reporting, there's great data visualization, and yet we have certain individuals who we still have a serious problem. There is not a response to how these data are presented. And if I had an easy answer on how to land that data, how to make that reporting and those visualizations more emotionally narrative salience in a way that enabled a collective response, the world might be a different place. But I think it's a clear gap in moving from presentation and knowledge to meaning and meaningfulness. And perhaps opening up some of that transparency, opening up the definition of open to those who may have a better pulse on what's salient could be really important. And I would argue that that's probably really important in terms of building social movements on other issues. And it goes back to the point that Javier made, and I think all of us have made, about making sure that the way we make data open is accessible for people to ask different questions and to share the answers to their particular questions and the perspectives those create for maps, visualizations, everything else. So it's widespread access to the back end, not just the curated transparency or point that may help resolve some of this. Crowdsourcing more questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm allowed a couple more minutes to give you a couple more questions. And just to make it fair, we have one directed at Claudia. The next question is from Els Breedstreit. I'm not sure if I've pronounced the name correctly, but his question or her question is, can you explain more about your idea about grading down data portals? Claudia.
A lot has really to do with kind of how data is being aggregated, collected, and then how those data portals are being put together. It can, for example, mean that local and regional groups add their own data to those portals. that could be one way of doing it. The combination of different data sets and facilitating that in a different way. I mean, those are some examples that come to mind. So, for example, I know WRI is working on that, and I don't know, Jessica, if you have further insights into that, but 8Data, another grantee that we are working with, who's providing through its portal GeoQuery, geospatial data. I mean, all of these are efforts to provide better data at the subnational level.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And one final question, Stefan, you can decide whom this can be addressed to, from Mike Bloom. How to tap into potential for data use for NGOs better? What is needed to create a culture of data use for NGOs?
Seems obvious that Claudia is the one to answer that. So over to you, Claudia.
Yeah, that is really at the core of what we are working on. I think one important aspect is really to move from a kind of one-off project mentality to kind of treating data as something that is integral to the organizational strategy and vision and a competency that different teams within the organization have at different levels. At the moment, a lot of it is focused in the monitoring and evaluation unit, and that means that a lot of it is also backward looking and not necessarily forward looking, but we need not the same, but kind of different data capabilities in the programmatic and the strategy units, also looking ahead and kind of guiding the full organization. But as I said in my kind of big introductory remarks, I think what's critically important for that to happen is really the vision of the leadership. Is data-driven decision making valued at the organization? Is it demanded? Are those kind of questions that are being raised when decisions are being made? What is the underpinning of the data? Are these investments supported that could be significant in some of these cases? So I feel those are critical indicators for that to happen.
Thank you, Claudia, Javier, and Jessica, and Stefan, of course, for this very, very interesting roundtable. And to all of you, continue your questions, continue to network online. You have access to Swap Card. You can ask the questions directly. I can see them coming in. I'm quite sure people will take the time to answer them. It was a really interesting discussion, so thank you so much. And now it's time for a very well-deserved 15-minute break. We're going to have our sessions after the break, the thematic sessions, and they will be hosted also by my colleagues. So I will be moderating session 1, creating open data ecosystems, and you can join Chris Burns for session 2, data for people, and Jennifer Baker for session 3, facilitating data reuse, I should say. So make sure you're back here for 3:30 promptly and enjoy whichever session you choose to join. Meanwhile, have a quick cup of tea and start networking. Thank you so much.
Thank you.